Okay, so your brain assumes that everything is relevant and important until you learn that it isn't. And once you learn that it isn't, you don't even pay any attention to it. And then your brain basically removes the blocking from things dependent on your state of motivation, and that's what makes it relevant. So for example, if you get hungry, if you're not hungry, food's irrelevant. If you are hungry, then the latent inhibition gets stripped off the food. And so all of a sudden it's all meaningful and interesting. Again, just like it was before you learned that it was irrelevant. Here's a list of amygdalic outputs. Same idea basically applies. So the sensory systems put input into multiple levels of the nervous system, but the emotional systems and the motivational systems also have multiple levels of output to the brain hierarchy. So Ledoux has identified, this is partly associated with anxiety. Tachycardia, increased heart rate, galvanic skin response, paleness, pupil dilation, blood pressure elevation. Ulcers, this is more chronic, urination, defecation, again bradycardia, panting, respiratory distress, behavioral and EEG arousal, increased vigilance, increased attention, heightened startle, freezing, hypoalgesia, so you can't feel pain as much, facial expressions of fear, and corticosteroid release. So you see that when you say, well, what's fear? It's like, well, it's a multi-level phenomena, and it manifests itself across different hierarchies of the nervous system. And so, and those systems differ in complexity, and they differ in speed. You know, and the other thing for humans, what's happening if you encounter something anxiety-producing is it sends a signal up to the right hemisphere, and it says, provide a quick and dirty model of this, and then it tells the left hemisphere, and if you can, explore a bunch to gather new information so that we can improve the model. And so that's basically how you're responding to novelty. Now, the next thing I'm going to tell you, not today, is two things. One is how these hierarchical systems emerge across time and how they're interrelated. But then, and this is where we can really move in another direction quickly, I want to show you how these domains, because we've outlined some domains, right? The domains are things that turn out the way you want them to, things that don't turn out the way you want them to, structures of representation, and modes of updating that structure of representation. So you can think about those as they're constants. Some things you can predict and understand, some things you can't. That you can explore, you can be conventional, and there's a characteristic nature of the domain that consists of things that you do not expect or desire. So, the next hypothesis is, those are the things that are represented in mythology. And the reason they're represented is because they're constants. They're always there. And so what mythology does, it isn't doing this, this is just what happened, is it lays out these domains, it attributes to them certain characteristics, and then it says, on average, here's how you should conceptualize them and deal with them. And that's what stories are. So what I'll do next is I'll show you the symbolic realms, and then we can walk through how those are manifested in stories. And you'll see that the stories all of a sudden become alive, and that's really cool because the stories are really useful. And not only are they useful, they're accurate. They actually tell you what to do. So, and things, chaos and order. Okay, those two of them. Order is where things that you want to happen, and chaos is where things you don't want to happen. And then the next thing, broadly speaking, is the thing that mediates between those. And that would be your consciousness. And then there's a fourth category, which is a really weird category. And it's the category from which all those things emerge. So that's a really rough one to get your head around, but it's sort of something like this. There's unknown things that you can more or less conceptualize and categorize because they're not completely outside of your experience. And then there's the unknown as such. It's sort of like raw potential. And that potential, the mythology conceptualizes that potential as the fundamental bedrock of being. And it assumes that all those other phenomena emerge out of it. So you emerge out of potential. That's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about the mythological representation. So we're going to lay those out in detail. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories using those categories and walk you through it. I'm going to tell you how those mythological categories are constituted and what they mean. And then we're going to figure out how they need to relate to one another. And so good stories tell you how they relate to one another. That's what makes them good. So, and you know that because otherwise you wouldn't know the difference between a good story and a bad story. So that's what's coming up. And so hopefully I won't have to go over what we went over today again, but I really need you to get this first part clear, because otherwise when we go to the next stage it won't make any sense at all. So, okay, good.